Tyranny. It's as American as beer and baseball. This is the America Beer, Baseball, Tyranny podcast with your hosts, Joshua Sopko and Aaron Bloomer. Josh, here we are.
What's up, man?
Episode 1, America.
Version 1.
Beer, Baseball, Tyranny.
Tyranny, yes.
Excited, man.
I'm kind of nervous.
I'm excited.
Yeah. You don't get nervous about things.
No, I try not to. But, so what are we doing here?
Yeah, it's this podcast about America and baseball and beer and tyranny.
More about beer and tyranny. Probably.
Yeah. I don't really know much about baseball, but it's an American staple, so people get
We
it.
probably should do an episode about something with, I don't know, at some point. But
I have a signed baseball card of Kirby Puckett from the Minnesota Twins.
okay.
So I met him once. And I was like, yay, big, about this tall.
Yeah. Sweet.
So I got baseball. I got baseball cards.
My dad's a huge Twins fan. He's got like...
Does he want to buy my baseball cards?
He might. He probably would.
Sweet. I don't think they're worth much.
So we're going to just talk here about things that you and I talk about every day.
A lot of stuff.
Anyway. So that's kind of what spurred this is we started a podcast a while ago that fizzled out due to many different reasons.
Right.
The timing wasn't right, I think is the biggest part on either of our ends.
Right.
Circumstances have changed. We decided to quit half-assing this and quit dinking around. And you and I message too much every day almost about news items and different things because I like to poke you a little bit. I think that's a fun part to do. But I think we have good conversations just about like, what does this mean? What's going on in Pierre, in Washington? What are the police doing? Why are we as citizens giving up our rights? What's going on? And I think this podcast is going to be just us taking what we've done already on Facebook Messenger and recording the audio and the video and putting it online.
So Facebook knows everything that we're going to be talking about already.
Oh, yeah.
Because they've been reading our conversations and cataloging them all.
Yeah, they've definitely flagged you for sure.
Yeah.
And just simply because I associate with you, I'm sure I've been flagged as well.
I'd be disappointed if I'm not on a list somewhere.
Yeah. So I think from the most part, let's talk about from a political standpoint where we're at or where this podcast is. I like to think we're pretty middle of the road. I like to think myself is pretty middle of the road, which then I consider, I don't know what I consider. I mean, I agree personally with a lot of libertarian type policies and thought, but I agree with, Republican things. And there are even some Democratic things I think we need to at least think about and consider in things. But I think as a whole, I lean more conservative.
Yeah, and most libertarians do too. And not that this is a partisan podcast, or not that I'm promoting any party or anything like that. I've quit associating with parties. I've officially left our local libertarian. I've not registered as a libertarian anymore for a lot of different reasons. So like that's abstract. But there's that quadrant chart that puts you into kind of these boxes of essentially authoritarianism. Like how authoritarian are you? And the libertarians always end up on the bottom right of that spectrum. And the Republicans are somewhere, middle right or top right. They've got a little bit, they like to force people in some regards. But mostly Democrats are by and large on the far left upper side of that more authoritarian style of thought. And so I always struggle when people say, well, are you left or right leaning? Well, so what's the issue?
Right.
And so I don't even really know if middle of the road is an appropriate. I mean, it's almost got to be a 3D chart where, there's left and right. And then there's others who just subscribe to just not force, non-aggression, which applies differently across the board of left or right ideologies that we know of today anyways. So.
Yeah. I just like to follow my hero, Ron Swanson here.
who was
breakfast food is the best meal of the day,
right?
Best food, all that good stuff.
Yeah, I thought well, at first you were going to say Ron Paul, because Ron Paul's my big hero. He led the charge of the Liberty Movement in 2008, and then he caught a ton of traction in 2012. And he brought more people to the Liberty Movement in the history of ever, basically, since as far as I can remember. So he's regarded as sort of the Liberty Movement hero of the day, anyways.
Yeah.
And he's a living and breathing person who served like 30 years in Congress.
Yeah, I want to look into James Wilson a lot more too. I've heard his name a little bit. He was one of kind of the founders of the Constitution, or a part of that group of men who was in the discussion, or at least in the room. And from what it seems, he was always for more liberty-minded, giving the control to the people type of mentality. I don't know enough about him to say whether he's a good guy or not, because odds are there's something in his, all of those guys back then, there's always something that comes out where it's just like, ooh, that's not good.
Yep.
But it's a sign of the times, that too. But
it is.
So, yeah, I mean, so what's the ground rules or groundwork we want to lay? I think what we're going to be talking about a lot is obviously the Constitution. We're going to be talking about rights.
A lot about rights.
And a lot about liberty.
Yep.
So I think a lot of people think... So you and I had the conversation about the Constitution before, of where I made an uneducated question of what rights does the Constitution guarantee, or along that line. And you said that's not what it's for.
The Constitution doesn't guarantee anything.
Right. So what is the Constitution for?
I'm going to get eaten alive already right away. I have a lot of issues with the Constitution, and everybody, Republicans and Democrats all tout the Constitution, and then they turn around and make laws that break it every single day. And it's like, well, you say that you're a lover of the Constitution, then we have the Patriot Act, which both sides of the aisle support like crazy, and they give money to it like crazy. Both sides of the aisle unilaterally supported the 13th Amendment, which basically built the Federal Reserve and allowed for income tax to happen. Like, that's not a liberty-minded, that's not a constitutional thing, even though it's now a part of the Constitution as the 13th Amendment. Right. But when you start looking at the evil of Jekyll Island and how the whole Federal Reserve came about, how it was built, how this amendment was passed, you're just like, holy crap, it's unreal. The Constitution at its whole is meant to protect individual liberty. It's meant to constrain the federal government, not states. It's not meant to constrain states. It's meant to contain and specifically dictate the things that the federal government can do. And if it doesn't say that it can do that, then it cannot do that. And that's what the Constitution was set up to do. And then everybody touts the Bill of Rights. Well, the Bill of Rights is fundamentally named the wrong thing. It's really a bill of protection. We have these rights whether or not they were spelled out in the Bill of Rights or not. They're just protections to say the federal government cannot step on these things.
Right, because the Constitution was passed and ratified, or at the time the term, but it was passed without the Bill of Rights.
They were almost simultaneously passed. They were hand in hand.
Yeah, and so the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution.
Right. Which is a good conversation to have too, because, and I don't know much about James Wilson. I'll have to look him up after this, but when they were debating and arguing about the Constitution, there was the Federalists who were for the Constitution, and I'm using this term loosely, Federalist and Anti-Federalist, because realistically the true Federalists are the ones that are now, we refer to them as the Anti-Federalists for a lot of reasons, but that can be another entire podcast series about that. If you're interested, you can go listen to Brian McClanahan talk about it. But anyways, the Anti-Federalists were very against the Constitution, this idea of a national federal government, this central authority power, because they just got done fighting a war. I mean, literally just not even 10 years prior to that. Well, yeah, 10 whatever years prior to that. They had just got done fighting a really bloody war that they almost lost on numerous occasions. It's pretty stout miracle that we didn't lose.
Yeah.
And on that note, they said, we don't want this central authority. because history dictates, and these guys were some of the smartest men of their day in terms of political ideology and philosophy and historians about what governments had done in the past. And they knew every single time that a central authority steps on these rights. And the rights that are in the Bill of Rights that they were specifically drafting were all the rights that they saw their mother country impose on them,
right?
Like trying to take away guns or trying to take away speech, quartering soldiers in their homes, standing armies, illegal search and seizures, like all of these things. They said, well, these have what has happened to us. So we want to explicitly forbid the federal government from ever doing anything like this on us again. And the Federalists said, well, that can't happen because we didn't put those things in the Constitution. Ergo, the federal government can't do it because we didn't tell them that they had domain over that area. And the Anti-Federalist says, well, we don't really care because we know what's going to happen. So we need to protect these specific things. So that's what the Constitution was set up and meant to do. I know that was a long-winded answer, but it's important to note that the Constitution does not, it created the federal government and it told the federal government everything it can do. Anytime the federal government does something outside of its explicit terms, if I say, Aaron, you can do these 5 things and you do a 6th thing, you are out of bounds of the Constitution.
And unfortunately, it seems like it happens a lot.
And it happened starting with George Washington. So you can see how long we made it.
Yeah.
And then along comes John Adams, and immediately see the Alien Sedition Acts. He tried to pass laws about what you can and can't say. You can't speak out against the elected officials. You can't speak out against the government. I mean, it was just...
Yeah. You know John Adams is the only founding father to not own slaves?
No, I didn't know that.
Fun fact.
Fun fact.
Yeah, so then...
Wait a minute, the only founding father that didn't own slaves, or the only president that didn't? Founding president.
In the podcast it said founding father, but I don't believe James Wilson owned slaves either. So I think they possibly meant like founding father who was also a president.
That's what I would.
Which would probably seems more accurate,
right?
And then you can talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and how terrible they are, but that's a different podcast.
It's a different podcast.
So then that sets up federal. And then the difference between the federal government and state governments.
Right, which is one of the most important conversations that we could ever possibly have.
That no one has.
Right.
Right? Really?
Well, yeah.
I mean, we don't learn it in school?
No, you sure don't learn it in school.
You know,
the 10th Amendment is the key to this conversation. The 10th Amendment sets up the states' rights. The 10th Amendment explicitly writes out that the federal government cannot supersede what the states do or don't do. On pretty much every level. And that's the one that we see that we don't learn about it in school.
Right.
We don't even know how to read it. And it's just been long since forgotten until more recently, more groups. There's a group called the 10th Amendment Center, which specifically says, hey, this is where the federal government is specifically going outside for the 10th Amendment. And we need to start reeling in what the federal government is doing and imposing their will on the states unconstitutionally.
Sure. So what's the role of the federal government?
Yeah. The 17 things that's outlined in the Constitution. That's it. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, the federal government is really charged with defending the borders of our home state or our home land, right?
Sure.
It does not authorize going and invading other lands.
What?
Believe it or not.
What?
And if they do such a thing, they have to get the approval of Congress, which you haven't done since World War II, which is another podcast conversation about that too. But so that's one of their big things. Another one is to protect individual liberty, whereas individuals are to be protected from federal tyranny, from the government doing more things. I mean, there's not a lot it can do. It has a balanced budget. It's supposed to anyways. So.
Okay, then state-wise, what are each individual state's roles in, I mean, immediately I think protecting us, who protects us, but again, that's a different conversation too. But what's the difference between the states' roles? So each state can have different rules, laws, which they do.
Every state has its own constitution, and it's that constitution that dictates what that state should look like. realistically, at its foundation, a state should be able to do whatever it needs to do for whatever its citizens think it needs to do.
Mm-hmm. So what about when we get these actions from the federal government? You know, in the 50s, it was interracial marriage was legal. In 2015, you know, gay marriage is legal. And that's then from the federal government that's supposed to be binding state across all 50 states and outlying whatever's. So that's not their jurisdiction.
So we're going to have probably a series of podcasts on the 14th Amendment to talk specifically about this question. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of debate as to whether or not the Constitution applies to states, the federal Constitution. The 14th Amendment made that conversation really, really tricky. Prior to the 14th Amendment, if a state wanted to ban guns and they didn't have it in their state constitution, right? Which every single state except for one, and I can't remember who it is. I want to say it's Iowa or something like that. Every single state has a Second Amendment style right to bear arms clause in their constitution. When the states were drafted, or when the states were founded after our federal government was created, they were more or less compelled to include the Bill of Rights into their constitution. That's why almost every state has something that really mimics our federal constitution.
Well, each state, if I'm not mistaken, pushed to have a Bill of Rights when it wasn't passed with the Constitution. The Constitution seemed like more of a compromise of, okay, we got to get this thing done. Let's get it done. And then the next years immediately following were the state saying, wait a minute, we want this, we need that. And then that was when the Bill of Rights, and then the amendments to the Constitution have to be ratified by two-thirds of the states or something along those lines.
So. And I believe, though, that the Bill of Rights and the Constitution were both passed and ratified simultaneously. They weren't separate documents, because they knew that without the Bill of Rights, they were not going to get, because they made the commitment at the time that it had to be a unanimous thing. The 13 original states that had declared sovereignty as states, so they weren't colonies anymore by this point, which you can really think of them as individual countries at that point.
Sure.
And that's why they had the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation set up how these individual sovereign states were to deal with each other. There's a lot of issues with how that was happening. States were tariffing other states. They were having issues with trade importing across a state. So they were trying to block or ban and say New York can't trade with a southern state without paying taxes across the other states along the way. So there's a lot of issues that were happening in this regard for a lot of different reasons. And so when they went to convention to amend the Articles of Confederation, there was a handful of delegates there that said, no, we're not going to do that. And it was a coup. It was literally a coup of saying, we're going to abolish the Articles of Confederation. We're not even going to have that conversation. We've come up with something better. And ergo, the Constitution was the conversation that was had for the entire summer.
George, wasn't it George Washington?
No.
Who was it?
I don't remember the names. He was a part of it.
Right. He was a part of the one saying, yeah, this isn't what we actually came to talk about.
Right. Yep. And so all the delegates were like, what? Like, they were completely shocked and surprised. That was not what they came there to do. And that's ultimately what ended up happening. A handful of them ended up leaving through this process. And they said, there's no way that we're going to install a central federal authority. These were all war veterans. And they said, we just left this. We didn't come here to do this. And they left. A lot of them left during the Three-Fifths Compromise. I think there were 7 of them that walked out the door because they said, this is why we're not doing this.
Right.
They wanted to abolish slavery completely. They said, we're not going to install an institution that forces a state to do one thing or the other. And if we're not going to guarantee all rights equally for every single person in this land, we're not going to be a part of that conversation. They left.
Right. That was a crazy time, man.
The Three-Fifths Compromise is the original, like, everybody's like, oh, you got to compromise in government. It's the original point when we immediately see tyranny and authoritarianism authoritarianism happen, like right at the front door before we even passed anything.
I still need to look into that stuff further, but I mean, the thing that I've read about it is just crazy. You know, where there were the vast majority, I think, potentially, of people there wanted no slavery. And then there were few states who were unwilling.
There was enough states to make the entire process stall without having an institution of slavery, an institution where their House of Representatives were going to be, because that was the whole thing with Three-Fifths Compromise. How do we count for population to have a proper amount of representatives in the House that they were working on creating? And that's when they said, well, we'll count 3 slaves as one person. 3 out of every 5 slaves will be one person. And then because they knew that if they didn't get that, then their institution of, then the northern states would own the federal government basically, and then they could abolish the states.
All right, that's a rabbit hole for another day.
Crazy conversation indeed.
So rights.
We
talk about rights. What rights? Again, the wording here is important.
Yep. Inalienable rights. Enumerated and unenumerated rights. Fundamental rights.
Who gets rights? First, before we talk about what they are, who gets them?
Every living person. Period. So, and I hear sometimes people say that the government needs to pass an equal rights law.
That's a big deal.
It is a huge deal.
That's a huge thing right now.
Yep. It's a 1970s
Equal Rights Act. Yeah.
The Equal Rights Act of the late 70s, which has a really long, complex, and interesting story. It's
women's
trying
suffrage.
to be.
Didn't it start with women's suffrage?
It did. And what I always kind of cringe when people say we need an Equal Rights Act or an Equal Rights Law, because we all innately, naturally, the moment we exist, have equal rights. Everybody has. It's just whether or not they're being recognized,
understood.
Understood, valued. I mean, stepped on, whatever.
So then, what about the big piece that was missing from that definition is citizen or non-citizen.
Person.
Doesn't matter if they're a citizen of the United States.
So I've already made the Democrats mad, and now I just made all the Republicans mad, because the whole idea of and the Constitution backs this up too, that if you come across the border, you get protected by the Constitution, whether you're here legally or illegally. You're not automatically, you don't get guaranteed rights. Yep. You're a person. These rights exist outside of society. They exist outside of government. They were granted to us by our Creator, whether you subscribe to that being God or some higher power, divine authority, the nature, universe, whatever you want to call it. These rights exist there, and anything that we do to step on them is immoral and wrong.
So the interesting story was it Standing Bear?
Yeah, that's a good story.
In the 1800s.
Yeah, 1864.
If you don't know that story, check that out. It's a crazy, interesting.
Can we post
story.
links in comments? Is there a thing that we can do that? We'll post a link to the story.
We'll figure it out.
We'll post a link to that story because it is a super fascinating story about Standing Bear. But yeah, he was a person. He was not a citizen, and he had to fight to be guaranteed a person, and he wasn't even considered a person.
Yeah, Native Americans or Indians, whatever, were not considered people.
Yep. Literally, we're not considered people. And what's really fascinating about that story, I won't get into the weeds about it, but the judge that was ruling over this case had fought Indians in the past. He considered them to be savages. He did not like the Indian people. And yet he went back and he deliberated for 10 days, and ultimately he went to Webster's Dictionary of the 1860s, and he looked up the definition of a person. And it was a person with a living soul or something. I can't remember the definition, but he came back and he said, I look at this guy and that's that. So you're a person.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Now
it's interesting, but now it seems that we're slowly, but potentially surely evolving away from that in a way. Some people want us to, I feel like specifically with Mexico. I mean, there's a huge, obviously with Trump as president on border walls and border security and those things. And so, Yeah, that's an interesting topic.
Yeah.
So
That'll be another podcast for sure.
absolutely. So then what are those rights that are, and again, I say granted, you say they're not granted.
They exist.
So the rights that are not even afforded, it's just that I'm born with.
Right.
Those are not me, not even just me, not just you, but every single because I agree with you on this, our definition, every single person is born with. So what are these rights?
I specifically haven't used the word born with for the abortion conversation.
Ooh.
That'll be another one.
Oh, geez.
But specifically, I haven't used that.
Okay.
Otherwise, the rights that exist are ones for you get to own your body, and basically, as long as you are not harming another individual or their stuff, it's your right to do so. Mm-hmm. Whatever that is, you get to do that. And that's why we can't sit there and start making a list. And the founders were clear about saying that we're making this list of Bill of Rights. This does not include everything.
Oh, yeah.
These are just the ones that we're specifically saying.
The Bill of Rights was initially longer, too, I believe.
Yeah.
And then based on what got ratified was the most important 10. Yep. So, yeah. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. I mean, can that boil it down?
Yep, it can.
To a simple level outside. I think life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness is an interesting one. As it's life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness.
But it is not happiness. You do not have a right to happiness.
Correct.
You have a right to pursue happiness.
And also your pursuit of happiness, if it infringes on someone else's happiness or liberty or life. So it's almost, you're afforded life. You're granted the rights that exist are life and liberty.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Cool. We just solved life's problems.
Right?
That's it.
And that's the thing that everybody starts to say, well, what about my right to do X? Well, that right is stepping on the right of someone else, so you don't get that as a right. If you want that right, you own property and you can do that all you want on your own property.
Yeah. I think the interesting conversations too is the right of healthcare, the right to an education, the right to this, the right to that. And again, another thing we'll go deep into, I'm assuming here in the relative near future, people feel those are rights. And I think I would probably disagree with that.
You cannot have a right that conscripts someone else for their service. So when people say I have a right to health care, that means you have a right to the service of someone else.
So you're telling me that I have to make a doctor give me surgery because I have that right?
Yep.
That person needs to go to school for 10 years, rack up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt.
Because I have a right to their skill, to their skill set.
What else are we going to talk about on this podcast?
Oof, I don't know. We covered a lot of stuff. We have
some crazy bills.
Yeah, our state bills. There's some other good state bills that exist outside of our state in South Dakota that I think that we should definitely cover. But yeah, we've got some crazy bills going on in our state right now. Most of them are all bad, like really bad. A bill that would create a law that makes another law illegal. That one's not up for it, is it?
The plastics one.
Oh, sure.
So there's a I don't know what it's called, a bill right now that would make it illegal to make plastic bags illegal.
Right. They want to ban communities and cities from banning plastics. And I've listened to the conversation about it, and I guess there's valid points, but at the end of the day, I love this phrase and quote, to think locally, act locally. The closer our government is to us, the better. The people at our state capitol, they don't know what's going on in our community to best serve our community. So if our community has and I'm not suggesting that anybody do this, but if our community had such a disastrous problem with plastics, and we wanted to say our community is no longer going to allow plastics. Again, I don't support this. Please nobody take this video snippet and say he supports banning plastics, because I don't. They should be allowed to do that.
Each individual city.
The state, in my opinion, and
Josh, what about the turtles?
What about the turtles? And
again,
one of our state representatives is quoted as saying that the deer use the plastic jugs in the river to drink out of.
Yeah, that seems totally legit.
And they use them for their habitat. And I don't know. That's
the crawfish habitat.
Yeah.
That's why I was talking online with Mark Henderson about and you were in that tag,
yep,
about the windmill blades.
Yep.
Sink them in the ocean. They'll be habitat.
I don't know if fiberglass holds up in salt water.
So there's some crazy stuff going on in the state.
There's a vaccine bill in our state that's a good one that we'll probably talk about next episode maybe.
I'm trying to twist his arm into talking it, ladies and gentlemen.
I thought maybe not for the very first episode anyways, but that one's kind of near and dear to my heart for a lot of reasons, and it really boils down to individual liberty and freedom. So a lot of that is going to come into just individual liberty and what the government's role is. So yeah, there's some really good bills about military coming out of a lot of different states that I think we should talk about. And
I love talking about police.
Yeah, police is another really good one. That's
schools, teachers is another one I love talking about.
Yep, I'm good with talking about schools. So a lot of really good stuff, and I think our name really is going to get into it. And what we talked about today was really good because at the end of the day, and you're probably going to hear me say this a lot, because the more people start to ingrain this in their brain, the more they start to understand when you're passing a law, what that really means. And government equals force. All the time. Pretty much every time government passes a law, at the end of that law is someone with a gun who is going to enforce that law.
Even if it's a law outlawing another law.
So at the end of the day, you really have to start thinking about, is this a law that I would personally be willing to go to someone else and put a gun to their head and say, you must obey this law for whatever reason? And some people say, yeah, I'll do that, but it's easy to say that versus actually thinking about what that means. And this is as simple as a seatbelt law. People throw that one out all the time. It's a law to wear your seatbelt. Play that whole scenario out from not wearing your seatbelt, driving down the road without your seatbelt on. You haven't hurt anyone. You haven't really committed a crime. You haven't involved a victim anywhere. Now, I'm not saying seatbelts aren't safe and you shouldn't wear one, because you should. Mm-hmm. But if you don't, someone with a gun is going to make sure that you have had a punishable offense for breaking that law. Notice I didn't say committing a crime, because in my opinion, you haven't committed a crime. You've broken a law.
So we've talked about these types of scenarios many times back and forth, and originally I thought you were crazy.
The more you start thinking about it.
One thing I have to say about that is look at the Sandra Bland case.
Which one's that?
Blinker. Didn't use her blinker, got pulled over, escalated, and then she committed suicide in jail.
No way.
Outrageous, man. It was in Malcolm Gladwell went in pretty depth in that in his newest book, Talking to Strangers.
Interesting.
Look into that case where this person did literally nothing wrong. The cop got. We don't have time for this. We can go into it right now. It's a long thing, but so my thing is I'm excited about just getting in and talking to things. I think my role is to hopefully dumb it down so I understand things, because I want to learn about these things. I want to learn more about myself and how to, and things like that. And I hope we do that for our audience too. We're not experts in anything. No. I think we're going to be we're the first to admit that, but I think,
and I'm going to say some things that are wrong.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We're going to,
especially historically. I'm a big, I love history and diving into history. That doesn't mean that I'm always going to get it right. Yep. And so I'd love to hear when we're wrong, but
yeah, we're going to piss some people off.
We're definitely we're not going to make friends.
No.
But we're going to challenge the ideas of a lot of things.
And I think that's important. I think especially having a civil dialogue and civil conversation is extremely important. And I hope we get to do this. We are on Facebook and Twitter at ABBT Podcast.
At ABBT
Podcast. So, yeah, America, beer, baseball, tyranny podcast.
Yep.
The website will be at beerbaseballtyranny.com.
Yep, we got the .com.
So we'll have all the audio there. We'll have our videos uploaded to YouTube. Please reach out to us on Facebook, on Twitter, anywhere that you want to start a conversation, have a dialogue or any questions. We hope to have guests at some point.
Yes.
You see our pretty lean setup right here. We helped. We'll build this out as we go too. I thought the biggest thing is we can't be perfect, but I think we need to get going.
Yep.
And so here we are getting going.
Yep. Absolutely.
Awesome, man.
I appreciate it. Thanks for watching us ramble.
Good first episode.
Good. I liked it. So, thanks.